The flames. History's greatest secret and key to a future where ships travel lifetimes to bring flames to new worlds. Those who dare to walk the fire can cross between the stars with a step if you can find a ferryman and pay your way across. For most who brave the flame alone are lost forever. May the ferryman take you.
Flame in the Night by Nathan Lowell. When the Esmeralda foundered, I prayed I might drown before the sharks ate me. In those days of my youth nothing frightened me more than the thought of those fierce fish savaging my limbs, tearing away my living flesh as I screamed. I remember the flood of relief that swept through me as the gales that battered our ship also pushed a small band of survivors away from the wreckage and onto the white sand shores of what I now know as Florida. Fresh from our ordeal at sea, we found ourselves faced by a warrior band of natives from the Calusa tribes who slaughtered all my companions but took me as a pet. For the next 17 years I lived among the sawgrass and lagartos, huge toothed lizards that seemed to live in every water-filled hole and swale on that sweltering, God-forsaken coast. In the past I have written of that time in my memoir, but I kept one memory locked away, a memory so strange that even now I question whether it had been a fever dream or something that actually happened. With the winter of my life upon me, I feel compelled to share this strange story before I face the Almighty. Here, then, is the final tale of Hernando de Escalante Fontaneda. During my time as captive, my captors frequently took me along on their perambulations across the land. We regularly toured the villages surrounding Lake Miami and ventured into the trackless waste filled with naught but the grasses that cut my skin and the huge lizards which sometimes they killed and ate, the tail being a delicacy among them. Here and there we would find scattered collections of huts, sometimes no more than 5 or 6 with a double handful of natives. On one such occasion, during what might have been my 3rd year of captivity, we found ourselves following the light of a glowing fire as the curtain of night fell across the landscape. For those unfamiliar with this land of Florida, consider a plain. Flat as a platter with only small hummocks rising out of the bog, a maze of waterways, scrub trees, palmetto brush, and sawgrass hinders any direct movement on foot. Dawn and evening crash into the landscape with fierce abandon, taking the darkness of night into full day with little civilized preamble, and throwing a velvet curtain across the brightness of day with only the slightest of warnings as the sun sinks in the west. During one of those evenings we found ourselves following a golden flicker through the strengthening darkness. While on the trail, my captors spoke little and kept their eyes moving across the landscape. That evening they seemed more subdued than ever, and I confess to feeling a small amount of trepidation in my own breast. Fire big enough to see at a distance was not something often seen in the muggy atmosphere of Florida. In winter, of course, but the late autumn evenings stuck to the skin like moss. We paused at the edge of the clearing, my captors standing just inside the ring of pin oaks, and waited for the people within to acknowledge us. They were a handsome people, well-formed and muscular, nearly naked, as was the local custom. What set them apart was not so much the color of their skin, a pale golden color that seemed strangely at odds with the brick and ochre tones of other natives, but rather the elaborate tattoos that decorated them. Each one, from the youngest to the gray-haired elder who sat in the place of honor, displayed leaves of flame about their ankles and around their wrists. Some children seemed to have simple patterns, others had flames dancing halfway up their thighs. The patriarch showed flames all the way to his hips and shoulders, while other adults had patterns no higher than those of the children. As I pondered the significance, the patriarch raised a hand in a sign of acknowledgment, and my captors led me into the midst of the village. We were soon seated beside the village elder and my Calusa captives, usually haughtily superior in their dealings with local chieftains, bowed with expressions of great respect. I followed suit as best I could and watched the old man's flinty eyes sweep across the party and stop on me. "Who is the stranger you bring to my fire?" he asked. The leader of our band, one named Ochote, answered. "He is a pet given to us by the sea. He entertains us." The old man's mouth turned down in an expression of doubt. "What does he do?" "He can dance a little," Ochote said, "and he sings in a strange voice." The old man turned to me again. I saw the flickering of the fire reflected by some strange magic in his dark eyes. For a long moment he regarded me in silence. "Do you understand me, boy?" he asked, using the captor's language. "I do, master." He said something else that I could not understand, but which sounded like something the family priest might have said over dinner. He paused with a raised eyebrow. I shook my head. "And this, do you know these words?" he asked in the pure Catalonian of my grandsires. I had not heard that language spoken for many years, yet the words fell like water on a desert flower. They blossomed in my mind so suddenly they struck me dumb. I merely nodded. The old man nodded in return, and looked to my captors. "He is far from his home." They glanced at me, their expressions stony and unreadable. "Yes," Ochote said. The old man nodded, and before long I found myself curled in the side of a hut, my belly full of food, and the drone of voices dancing in the humid evening air. An air made warmer, if a bit drier, by the crackling flames of their fire. As I drifted off to sleep, my eyes saw what my mind had not grasped. The fire burned in a ring of stone, and in all the time we had been in the village, not one person had fed the flames. Sleep took me before that thought could root. In the morning my captors woke me with the dawn, with their usual kicks and cuffs. The villagers fed us a meal of bread and fish, but the ancient headman did not join us even as the rest of the village gathered round for their morning meal. As I ate, I observed one of the young women adding a new leaf of fire to the tattoo of one of the youth. I watched idly as she expertly pricked his skin and applied a wash of pigment to the wound. The operation was over by the time we'd finished eating, and the time came for us to leave. Still the patriarch did not join us. One of the other elders in the small village, a spry man of later years, with only a few tattoos showing on his ankles and arms, stood in the patriarch's place and offered the rituals of leave-taking and obeisance. One phrase he used struck me strangely. In addition to the usual farewell and safe voyage, he said, "May the ferryman take you safely home." The phrase meant nothing to me, but it stuck with me because I have only ever heard that phrase from those strange golden people. As we set out on the day's trek, my captors led me out of the strange village. Before the palmettos and pin oaks blocked the view entirely, I took a final glance over my shoulder. Whether it was a trick of the light or some magic I have no name for, when I looked back, I saw a heavily tattooed man seem to walk out of the fire, stepping over the ring of stones as if over the threshold of his home. In that brief glimpse, it seemed to me that the tattoos covered his legs to his hips, and his arms to his shoulders. The patterns seemed identical to those of the patriarch, yet where that venerable had been stooped with age and crowned with snowy hair, this man strode with the upright spring of youth and vigor. A full head of chestnut hair swept back from unfurrowed brow. The villagers swarmed around him, and the trail took the vision out of my sight and out of my mind for many years. Over the years, I grew taller and stronger. I used my wits to learn as much of my captor's language as I could, and I kept my eyes open for an opportunity to escape. I heard that the king had appointed a new governor-general of Florida, and that the influence of Juan Ponce de Leon had extended further. Once I even heard my captors talking about ships sailing along the western coast. I was later to learn that it was Juan Ponce de Leon himself on a voyage of exploration. As the time wore on, I refused to let myself forget that some day, by the grace of God, I might resume a position in my native lands. Over the years, it became more and more difficult to maintain my faith until, nearly in the depths of despair, in the fall of my 17th year of captivity, chance took me by the hand and led me back to the strange village of golden-skinned natives. In that fall, I found myself once more following the glimmer of a fire in the distance. My captors moved quickly through the sawgrass and bogs, casting anxious eyes over a shield of storm clouds forming to the east. Florida suffers from fierce storms and seldom gets through 2 years in a row without a monster storm scourging the landscape with a flail of wind-driven rain. These ferocious storms most generally sweep from east to west in a paroxysm of wind and water, leaving the natives battered, their homes destroyed, and their numbers diminished. We had had no serious storm the year before, so I watched the oncoming blackness with as much anxiety as my captors. So it was with one eye cast back over my shoulder and one eye on the fires ahead that I stumbled into the clearing once more, the warm, moist wind of a hurricane at my back and the achingly dry fire in its ring ahead. The village itself seemed unchanged in any way. The patriarch with his tattoos sat in the place of honor, and the villagers seemed much as any other villagers. Something about the village seemed odd, eerily wrong. When Ochote gave his greeting to the headman, my eyes finally registered the truth. The headman appeared younger than Ochote. The realization took me back to our previous visit, unrepeated for those many years, and I saw as if the events had unfolded only the day before instead of nearly a lifetime. With a gasp I turned to look at the fire, seeing for the first time that it sprang as if from a fountain of stone arranged in the soggy ground. "Your attention is misplaced," Ochote snapped, and he cuffed me roughly on the ear. In truth, I had become long accustomed to his rough treatment, and this cuff was not as rough as some of the blows he had dealt me over the years. This blow unbalanced me, and I took a step toward the fire before falling to my knees. The elder rose from his seat, his flame tattoos seeming to dance on his skin as he moved, and all eyes turned to him. "Enough, Ochote," he said. "We have no time for this. The storm will be upon us soon." Ochote bowed his head in the manner that I'd learned was respect for a wiser man. "What would you have us do, elder?" "We seek refuge, but you must find higher ground. The water will rise with the winds, and none here will be safe. By morning it will be over, but for now you must leave us to our preparations." Ochote seemed confused, but as he opened his mouth to speak, the first gusts swept the clearing with a moist tongue. The headman pointed northward to a single tree, showing higher than the rest. "There, Ochote, that tree is firmly anchored, and you may find shelter in time if you go now." The villagers scurried about, dismantling the huts, bundling their belongings, and stacking them beside the fire. Ochote watched the preparations wordlessly before cuffing me once more, and our small band headed north toward the distant hillock and the sparse shelter it offered. We had not gone 50 yards before the storm winds descended on us. Wind drove rain across our path, blocking the view and sending needles of water stinging into our skins, even as the warm, moist air snatched at my body. I staggered against the onslaught and soon found myself cut off from my captors. After years of being a captive to the Calusa, I found myself alone in the wilderness, abandoned in the emergency like some unwanted shoe. I tried to call, but the wind struck the voice from my mouth even before I spoke, leaving me spitting out rain and gasping to pull breath. I put my back to the wind, hunkered over, and tried to find the direction to safety. Within moments, the rising wind had driven me to hands and knees while I groped almost blindly for a track, a trail of any kind. I'd only gone a few feet when my hand splashed into water. I thought I had fallen into one of the many sinkholes, but soon saw, to my horror, that what had once been a sawgrass and pin-oak swale was rapidly becoming a reed-choked sea. The wind lifted scud from the water and lashed the grasses to froth the surface. Dimly I saw one of the fierce lagartos drift by me, his heavy tail sweeping slowly as he sculled forward against the wind. I nearly laughed at the sight, so reminiscent of the shipwreck that took me to that foreign shore. Once more I was adrift in a storm-lashed sea filled with sharp-toothed creatures that would eat me given a chance. In all that I had experienced at the hands of the Calusa, I confess that being torn apart by lagartos seemed, somehow, less fearsome. At least it promised an end to my captivity. With that thought and the realization that I might yet find my freedom in this new circumstance, I caught a glimpse of the golden fire through the rain. With fresh resolve, I started back toward the clearing. It felt like ages. My arms and legs shook with the effort of pulling myself through the surging waters. My brain reasoned that there must be safety if the fire still burned. The rising water must not have reached the village. It must be on higher ground. 1,000 thoughts chased themselves around my brain, but none of them prepared me for what I found when I returned. When I finally pushed through the last verge of undergrowth, I found an empty lake. Empty, except for the flames dancing across the water. The villagers themselves had vanished. The huts and piles of goods, gone. I cast about to see if they had been washed away in the few minutes since we had left the clearing, but I saw nothing. No scrap of clothing, no floating bundles, just the open area with the fire burning on the water. I waded heavily through the wind-driven pond, drawn to the light and the heat like moth to flame. The vision of the wind-whipped flames skittering across the waves is one I'll never forget, and made all the more unreal by the brackish water being driven into my eyes. As the water rose, I found that I could get some protection from the wind by imitating the lagartos and sprawling full length in the water, floating my body just below the surface and drawing myself along with my hands on the ground. In moments, my fingertips found the fire-warmed stones, even as the dancing flames threatened my face and hair. I braced myself against those rocks, feeling the water lifting me up even as the deluge from above increased, sending sheets of water in barrels full raking across the clearing. In spite of it all, in the face of the wind and over the rising waters, the fire continued to burn. I stared at it. All thoughts of escape gone. Thoughts of survival lost in the swirling dance of fire and wind and water. In that dazed condition, I saw him, reaching his hand out of the fire, out of the flames. I pulled back from this apparition from the depths. My heart leapt to my throat in the sudden fear that this fire that only moments before had been my path to salvation was a manifestation of the fires of hell, and the figure reaching to pull me in was Lucifer himself. Then I saw his face, and the tattoos that danced across his skin. It was the headman, once more restored to the glowing youth that I had seen before. His smile flashed in the golden light, and his voice came to me as if from far away. "I am the ferryman. Come with me," in perfectly accented Catalonian. I reached forward into the flames and took his hand. He drew me into the fire, and I knew no more. When I regained my senses, I found myself waking as if from a solid night's sleep. I rested on a pallet inside one of the huts and blinked several times, trying to reconcile my surroundings with my memories. I pushed my way out of the hut and found the village much as I'd seen it before. Golden-skinned people went about the business of the day. A smiling child grinned up at me as he ran past. A woman thrust a bowl with stewed fish and vegetables into my hand. Here and there, in the surrounding trees, I saw freshly broken limbs and a bit of wrack hanging from the branches. The ground around the hut was perhaps a bit soggier, but with the frequent rains in the area, I couldn't be sure it was more than the residue of an overnight shower. Had it all been a dream? In the morning, Ochote fell through the undergrowth and into the village, alone. His arms were battered and bruised. A ragged scratch ran down the length of his thigh, dribbling blood. He staggered over to me and cuffed me once before his eyes rolled up and he fell heavily at my feet. The villagers grinned at me and helped me situate my captor in one of the huts. One of the women tended to his cuts and another brought broth for him to drink. In a few hours he was nearly as good as new. We spent the night in the village and resumed our journey the next day. The unmistakable signs of the storm and flood abounded. Broken trees blocked trails. Drifts of broken brush lay piled against windrows of pin oak. Villages that had once prospered in previous visits struggled to rebuild lost shelters. Food, as always, was plentiful, and it seemed that everywhere we found roasting fish and lagartos' tails. As for Ochote, He never mentioned the storm in my presence, and as his slave, of course, I could not talk to him about what had happened. Occasionally I caught him looking at me curiously. Whether it was a look of fear or simply one of speculation, I never knew. The mystery remained, even after Don Pedro Menendez de Aviles negotiated my release and I returned to the civilized world. I would have been happy to leave this curious episode in the realm of fevered dream, except for two things. First, I'm getting on in years. My eyes are failing, and my granddaughter's voices seem far away. I cannot help but think of the ancient elder of this village of golden people, the man who returns through his fountain of flame with the full fire of youth. I wonder if, perhaps, I might return to that fire and be restored myself. Second, on returning to my senses, I found that I had gained an artifact that I have no recollection of acquiring. On the inside of my ankle, a small tattoo of a flame dances. Whenever I look at it, I can hear the rich Catalonian accents of that tattooed man on another continent say, "May the ferryman take you safely home."
Walk the fire. Learn more at servingworlds.com. Music by Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.com. May the ferryman take you. Walk the Fire by John Miro. Learn more at servingworlds.com. Theme music, Full On by Kevin MacLeod of incompetech.com. Many of the stories you listen to at servingworlds.com were made possible by the support of patrons at patreon.com/servingworlds. If you like what you hear, please consider adding your support. Thank you for listening.